She was 11 years old, standing at the end of her driveway, less than 100 feet from her front door, and in a matter of seconds, she vanished. Her stepfather saw it happen. He ran after the car with everything he had, but it wasn't enough. The vehicle sped around a corner, disappeared from sight, and an entire community was left trying to make sense of a tragedy that would haunt them for decades. What followed became one of the most disturbing missing person cases in California history. Not because the mystery was never solved, but because of where she had been all along, and because authorities came dangerously close to finding her, again and again, without realizing it. This is the story of what happened in Myers, California, during the summer of 1991, and of how two university officers, nearly 18 years later, noticed what countless investigators had overlooked. To understand the significance of this case, it helps to remember what America looked like in the summer of 1991. The Gulf War had just ended, troops were returning home. News broadcasts were filled with images of the collapsing Soviet Union. Across much of the country, people felt safer than they had in years. That feeling was especially strong in Myers, California, a small mountain community of roughly 5,000 residents nestled in the Sierra Nevada. At more than 6,000 feet above sea level, it was the kind of place where neighbors trusted one another. Children rode bicycles through the streets. Front doors were often left unlocked. Parents felt comfortable letting their children walk to the bus stop alone. The Probyn family lived in one of those quiet neighborhoods. Terry Probyn believed in that sense of safety. Her daughter, J.C. Lee Dugard, was 11 years old that June. She was bright, energetic, and remembered by those who knew her for her cheerful spirit and warm personality. On the morning of June 10, 1991, near the end of the school year, J.C.'s stepfather, Carl Probyn, drove her a short distance to the neighborhood bus stop. He watched her step out of the vehicle and then turned back toward the house to continue his morning routine. He never made it inside. Within minutes, a gray sedan approached the bus stop where J.C. stood waiting. A man stepped out of the vehicle. His name was Philip Garrido. 40 years old and living in Antioch, California, nearly 200 miles away, Garrido had arrived with a plan. Carrying a stun gun, he attacked the 11-year-old girl, forced her into the vehicle, and within seconds his wife, Nancy Garrido, drove away before anyone nearby could fully understand what was happening. Carl Probyn witnessed the abduction from his yard. Without hesitation, he grabbed his bicycle and chased after the car. He pushed as hard as he could, but the gray sedan quickly disappeared down the road. Moments later, he found himself standing in the middle of an empty street, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Then he ran inside and called 911. The search effort began almost immediately. The El Dorado County Sheriff's Office, the California Department of Justice, and the FBI's Sacramento Field Office mobilized within hours. Volunteers arrived from across the South Lake Tahoe region. Search dogs combed through forests and trails. Helicopters surveyed the surrounding wilderness. Tips poured in from California, Nevada, and beyond. Investigators followed every lead they could find. None of them led to Philip Garrido. None of them pointed toward Antioch. While authorities searched mountains, highways, and neighboring communities, J.C. was already being held nearly 200 miles away. What makes this case especially difficult to comprehend is that Philip Garrido was not an unknown figure. He was not invisible to law enforcement. He was a registered sex offender on active federal parole. In 1976, Garrido had kidnapped a woman named Catherine Calloway Hall in Nevada. He held her captive, confined her in a shed, and subjected her to hours of abuse before police eventually intervened. For those crimes, he received a 50-year federal prison sentence along with a life sentence in state court. The intention behind those sentences was clear: to ensure he would never have another opportunity to harm someone again. Yet Garrido served only 11 years before being released in 1988. Just 3 years later, J.C. Dugard disappeared. Even more troubling, Catherine Hall had tried to warn authorities after Garrido's release. Having experienced his behavior firsthand, she understood the danger he posed better than anyone. She contacted his parole officer directly. She warned them that Garrido's behavior appeared to be escalating and that he required closer supervision. Her concerns were documented, but they were ultimately dismissed. According to records, officials concluded that her warnings reflected emotional distress rather than credible evidence of a threat. 3 years later, Philip Garrido arrived in Myers, California, carrying a stun gun and a plan. Yay, Raha Apka cleaned, professional AI voice-friendly documentary version. From the street, 1554 Walnut Avenue in Antioch appeared completely ordinary. A house, a front yard, the kind of suburban property that blends into thousands of others across the Bay Area. To neighbors, it looked like a quiet home occupied by a married couple. Nothing about it seemed unusual. But what existed behind the house told a very different story. Hidden behind dense trees, high wooden fencing, and heavy tarps designed to block every possible view from neighboring properties, Philip Garrido had spent years creating a concealed compound. There were tents, sheds, and narrow passageways connecting covered spaces. In total, nearly 900 square feet of hidden territory sat just beyond the backyard, an isolated world deliberately designed to keep its occupants out of sight. That hidden compound became J.C. Dugard's world for the next 18 years. During the early years of her captivity, she lived in near total isolation. She had no access to school, no regular medical care, and no contact with the outside world. Basic necessities that most people take for granted were absent. At just 11 years old, she found herself cut off from society in a way few people can truly imagine. Over the years, Garrido maintained complete control over her life. In 1994, when J.C. was only 14 years old, she gave birth to her first daughter inside the compound. There was no hospital, no doctor, and no professional medical assistance. 3 years later, in 1997, she gave birth to a second daughter under similarly difficult circumstances. Both children spent their entire early lives inside the compound. They had no birth certificates, no school records, and virtually no official presence in the outside world. To anyone who asked questions, Garrido simply referred to them as his granddaughters. His control extended far beyond physical confinement. Garrido carefully built an environment based on psychological manipulation. He portrayed himself as a religious figure chosen for a special purpose, creating a belief system in which he held complete authority. Over time, that controlled reality became the only world available to J.C. and her children. In her memoir, A Stolen Life, J.C. later described the immense challenges of surviving those years. She explained that escape was far more complicated than outsiders often assume. The birth of her daughters changed everything. Her focus shifted from surviving for herself to protecting her children and ensuring their safety. Meanwhile, opportunities to uncover the truth came and went. Between 1999 and 2009, federal parole officers conducted approximately 60 compliance visits to Garrido's residence. 60 separate visits. Each time officers arrived at the property, spoke briefly with Garrido, completed their paperwork, and left. Not once did they fully inspect the hidden compound behind the house. That fact remains one of the most troubling aspects of the entire case. Garrido's criminal history was well documented. His previous conviction involved kidnapping and confining a victim in a concealed location. If any parolee required thorough property inspections, it was Philip Garrido. Yet the backyard remained largely unexplored. As a result, J.C. and her 2 daughters continued living only a short distance away from where authorities repeatedly stopped their investigations. In 2006, another warning sign emerged. A neighbor reported hearing voices coming from behind the fence and contacted Antioch police. The caller specifically mentioned concerns that people appeared to be living in tents behind the property and that children could be heard in the area. Officers responded. They spoke with Garrido at the front door. Then they left. The backyard was never checked, and the report was closed without further action. 2 years later, in 2008, parole officials launched an additional review after receiving reports of unusual behavior involving Garrido. Investigators visited the property. They questioned him. And once again, they failed to inspect the hidden compound. Just beyond the gate stood 18 years of evidence. J.C., her 2 daughters, and the truth that investigators had missed time and time again. Then came August 24, 2009. On that day, Philip Garrido arrived at the University of California, Berkeley, accompanied by 2 teenage girls. The girls were his daughters with J.C. Dugard, though he did not identify them that way. Instead, Garrido appeared on campus seeking permission for a religious event connected to a group he called God's Desire. What happened next would finally begin to unravel the secret he had managed to hide for nearly 2 decades.